Life and death. They're a package deal. You don't get one without the other. And try as we might, it's really not possible to pull them apart. You know, in Japanese Zen, birth and death are one word, shoji. And there's no separation between birth and death except a very small hyphen that connects the two. There's no way to be really fully alive without embracing death. And this death, it's not waiting for us at the end of some long road or at the end of an illness. It's here, in the very marrow of our experience. She's the secret teacher. And because she's such a good teacher, she helps us to discover what matters most. And the good news, the really good news, is that we don't have to wait until the end of our life to learn what she has to teach. To imagine, in fact, that at the time of our dying, we will have the physical strength, the emotional stability, the mental clarity to do the work of a lifetime is an absurd gamble. This is ridiculous. Don't wait for that. I think without a reminder of death, we, of course, start taking life for granted. We get caught up in self-gratification. We get swept away. Whereas when we keep it really close at hand, right at our fingertips, I think what happens is we take ourselves and our ideas a little less seriously. I think we don't hold on so tightly. And I think this engenders in us a certain kind of kindness toward one another. It's the ephemeral nature of this life, the impermanence of this life that points us to how precarious it is. Absolutely precarious. I know a man who died and fell into his soup. Yeah, at the dinner table. It's absolutely precarious. And because of that, it puts us in touch with just how precious it is. Then we don't want to waste a moment. Then we want to jump into our life with both feet. Yeah. I'm not a romantic about dying. I've been around a lot of people who died. I don't have any romantic notions about it anymore. It's the hardest work we will ever do in our life. And it can be beautiful, but it can also be sad and cruel and very messy. But most of all, it's ordinary. All of us, every one of us, will go through it. None of us get out of here alive. Yeah? Maybe out of the conference, but that's not even guaranteed. Over the past 30 years or so, as Coach Kojin mentioned, by the way, haven't they done a remarkable thing here? Really, these two men, extraordinary men. I really want to bow to both of you and thank you for what you've done. I just think it's phenomenal that all that they've done and that we're all here together. Anyway, over these years, I've gotten to be with a lot of people, a few thousand people I've sat with at their bedside. And most of them were ordinary people, regular people like you and I. People who had to face what was impossible or what they imagined was unbearable, walking toward their own dying or accompanying someone they loved through their dying. Yet most of them, almost all of them, found in themselves and in the dying process the resources, the insight, the strength, the courage, and the compassion to meet the impossible in extraordinary ways. Some of these people I worked with, they lived in really terrible conditions. When we started Zen Hospice, I worked mostly with people who lived on park benches behind City Hall or in single-room occupancy hotels. We taught prostitutes how to take care of each other and alcoholics how to take care of each other and the desk clerk in the Ambassador Hotel how to take care of the people that were staying in the hotel. Most of them had lost all trust in humanity. And so if we were going to be of any help to them, we had to be real. Some of them came from cultures that I didn't know, speaking languages that I couldn't understand. Some of them had really deep faith and religious practice, and others of them had lost their faith many years before. Nguyen, Vietnamese man, was scared of ghosts. And Isaiah, who lived in the room just next to him, he was very comforted by visits from his dead mother. Yeah. And there was a man I worked with whose father, he was a gay man, dying of AIDS. His father had abandoned him. He'd thrown him out of the house. I remember calling the father to tell him that his son had AIDS, and he hung up. Some years later, that same father contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion. And I cared for his son and him in the same room, in twin beds, with Agnes, the husband's wife, and the boy's mother taking care of both of them. A lot of people I worked with died young, particularly at the beginning of the epidemic. And then there was Elizabeth, who at 93 said, "Why has death come for me so soon?" Some of them were clear as bells, and some of them couldn't recall their own names. Alex lived alone. He climbed out onto a fire escape one night and froze to death. For some of them, their dying was a great gift. They made remarkable reconciliations with family and with themselves. They found forgiveness and love, kindness and acceptance that they'd always hoped for in their lives. And for others, they turned toward the wall in withdrawal, and they never came back again. All of them, every one of them, were my teachers. And if I have anything of even a little bit of value to share with you, it comes from them. They're my teachers. They showed me. I've seen these regular people, ordinary people, make this movement from tragedy to transformation. Regularly, I saw it. And they discovered in themselves some kind of capacity that arose in the final months, weeks, days, sometimes minutes of their life. The possibility for transformation. Now you might say, that's too late, and I would tend to agree with you. But what's important is that if the possibility for transformation exists then, it exists now. There's a beautiful old Zen story that I'm sure Koshin and Chodo have shared with you at times. There's a student who comes to his dying teacher, and the student asks, what's the teaching of your entire lifetime? These questions only get asked in Zen books. No one really asks these questions, really. And very few teachers have answers to this. But this particular teacher did, and he said, of course, an appropriate response. What's the teaching of your entire lifetime? An appropriate response. And the highest teaching, it isn't always the most appropriate one. It can be very profound and liberating in some ways, but not appropriate to the situation. I have lots of tools. I have a big yellow toolbox full of tools. Yeah, but I try not to set those tools down between myself and the clients that I work with. One of us is sure to trip over them. So I don't lead with my tools. I lead with my humanity. And there's no deeper dimension of our humanity than our compassion. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, of course, compassion is inseparable from wisdom. Wisdom and compassion, they're the two wings that allow us to take flight, right? The two pillars that support our practice. Attempts at compassion without any wisdom, well, they get kind of mushy. And attempts at wisdom without any compassion, well, they're pretty heady. So we have to bring them together. And they're tied together in the development of something that you probably know, bodhicitta. Bodhicitta means the heart or the heart-mind's impulse to awaken. Now that doesn't sound very compassionate, actually. It sounds kind of selfish. Until you understand that awakening is the most altruistic thing. It's truly altruistic. It's always about the benefit of others. So awakening comes about by dropping self-cherishing ideas or notions of separateness. Each of us, everybody sitting here, is a manifestation of our most basic, essential nature. Not separate from it, no more than the waves in the ocean. I go to Hawaii regularly, and I have friends there who surf, and they're always trying to teach me about the waves. And I sit on the beach for hours with them, and they show me the waves and where it breaks on the reef and all this stuff, and I don't understand what they're talking about. I just noticed that every wave comes in its own way, crashes on the beach, and gets sucked back out to the ocean again. We're like that. And when we see it in this way, when we understand our basic nature to be this, all these ideas that we have, these fancy ideas of healers and healed and I and other, and well, they just don't hold up anymore. No matter what the slick magazines or the life hackers tell you, mindfulness meditation is always about community. It's always about us waking up together. That's why we're all here together. We want to wake up. And we do that for the benefit of everybody. We're tangled up in each other. We're completely interdependent with everything. And this doesn't require religion or some esoteric teaching to understand this. Everybody here, we can see it and we can ground it in everyday observation. Everybody here wants to be happy. Everybody here wants to have enough food to eat, to have a home, to be loved, to be seen, to be known. No matter how vast our difference is, we have a lot more in common. That's important to remember in the next 4 or 5 days before the election. That's really important to keep in mind. Once we've seen ourselves in others in this way, the way in which we take care of each other changes dramatically. When my left hand gets cut, my right hand reaches out for it immediately to take care of it. It doesn't ask what religion it is or what political affiliation it has, It just cares for it. It's the most natural thing. Children are better at this than adults. My son and I used to walk through San Francisco. He used to come to the hospice a lot. He was about 4 years old at the time, and we would walk down the street through the Tenderloin, and there'd be a homeless man there, and he'd say, "Dad, can we take him home?" And I'd say, "No, Gabe, we can't take him home. I wish we could, but we can't." And he'd say, "That's not fair." I said, "Well, how about if we just bring him for dinner? Can we do that? That'd be good?" "Yeah, that'd be good." So we'd invite the guy into the diner across the street, and the three of us would have dinner together and get to know each other. It's really important to understand this if we're going to understand compassion, because without this understanding of the profound understanding of the nature of selflessness, we will start trying to be compassionate from old models which have us being somebody special, somebody strong, some superhuman person, And then embracing suffering becomes dependent upon some special power, Buddhism says that if we don't have compassion, if we can't find it, we can awaken it. And we awaken it through love. Love's both the motivation and the destination. If you were to walk up here in the Palisades further, up to some mountain lake or go up to the Catskills, as to a lake you really love, you have to love the lake to make the hike, right? If you don't love the lake, you're not going to make the hike. But it's not enough to love the lake. You have to love the walk to the lake. Otherwise, when the mosquitoes come out, you will turn back, And it's like that with our awakening. We have to love the lake, but we have to love the way to the lake. Otherwise, it's too hard. We have to love the truth. And this dedication is more than just not telling lies. The attitude here is devotional. Love's the primary motivation that care arises out of. It's our fundamental sense of connection with each other. I think there's a fundamental truth when we say love is the best medicine. Anybody who sits for more than 5 minutes understands 3 basic things. We understand that everything changes. We understand that resisting that truth causes us untold suffering. And we understand that we're on the boat together. This is important to remember. Because when we try to meet suffering by ourselves, we can't do it. Can't do it. My friend Norman Fisher, a really great Zen teacher, wrote a beautiful book called Trainings in Compassion, a Zen approach to the Lojong practices. And he said, opening means opening to what is around us, to others, to the world, to our radical connectedness. I love that expression. He went on to say, bodhicitta is the feeling of love based upon a deep recognition that what we have called self, what we've called others are destinations, habits of mind, not realities. Real altruism isn't self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. It's not because we should be nice or we should be kind to each other. It's the profound recognition that self and other are not fundamentally different, just apparently different. I love His Holiness the Dalai Lama for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons I most love him is his laugh. And I also love how plain-spoken he is so often. And years ago, he wrote a beautiful thing where he said, "There is no denying that our happiness is inextricably bound up in the happiness of others." Does that make sense to you? It does, doesn't it? Yeah. And he goes on, he says, "And there's no denying that if society suffers, we suffer." True? And then he says, "Nor is there any denying that the more hearts and minds are afflicted with ill will, the more miserable we become." I love it that he says it that way. The more miserable we become. And thus he says we can reject everything else, religion, ideology, all received wisdom. But we cannot escape the need for love and compassion. It's pretty hard to believe that taking any action or acting in any kind of selfish way will make us happy. Taking any action that's only about us or acting in some way that's selfish will actually make us happy. It's impossible to hold on to that anymore. You can't believe it. Sure, we're going to fall into confusion. We're going to fall into self-cherishing. But the mask is off. If you are here today, the mask is off already. You can't go back. Trungpa Rinpoche said this once, a long time ago in an auditorium. He came in, he sat down, he said to the people, "I would like to give you your money back. If any of you want to leave now, this would be a good time. Because once you stay here, there's no turning back. Once you hear the Dharma, there's no turning back." So Buddhism has all kinds of lists, as you well know, and they have many, many lists about compassion, which drive me crazy. So I think of that as just two things, what we might call absolute compassion and what we might call relative compassion. Absolute or universal compassion, it's vast, it's boundless, it's inherent in the nature of reality. Everybody and everything has always been held in love, even if they didn't know it. And relative or everyday compassion is when we make an effort. We feed somebody, we change soiled sheets, we listen, we work for social justice. We're successful or we're not successful. Maybe we dedicate our whole lives. I've dedicated my whole life to trying to improve the care of the dying, to provide mindful and compassionate care to the dying. I've failed miserably, really. I wish I could say I was a huge success and that everybody in this country was getting mindful and compassionate care, but they're not. So you fail. It's a never-ending project. Relative compassion can seem exhausting. We want people to thank us. We get pissed off when they don't. So relative compassion has to be grounded in absolute compassion. Without absolute compassion, we're angry that people aren't grateful for our good actions, you know? But without relative compassion, absolute compassion is just a big abstraction. It's just a big prayer. And if prayers were enough to relieve the suffering of the world, it would have been relieved a long time ago. So absolute compassion needs us. It needs our arms and legs, our tongues, our eyes. This is how it takes shape in the world, through you. It begins, of course, with with the profound aspiration to try and end suffering. Because we've understood that we're not separate from anybody else. So we do our best to free ourselves and free ourselves from any thought of an outcome of our actions. Now, even when our life, as these two gentlemen have personified, is dedicated to compassion, we're going to be overwhelmed by suffering. That's going to happen. If it hasn't already, it will soon. And so we're going to need to pull back in such moments, pull back to engage the resources that we need to meet the situation that's in front of us. I might need to step back and recall experiences where people have been compassionate to me, or where I've expressed my compassion to others. Or I might need to come back and stabilize my attention to meet the emotional overwhelm. Or I might need to engage myself in some life-affirming activity. You know, when I worked with the Zen Hospice, we had sometimes 100 people dying in a week. at times the grief was overwhelming to me. And so I did three things. The first thing I did was I would get body work every week. And I would go to my body worker who didn't try to do anything fancy with me, you know. He would say, "Where today, Frank?" And I'd point to my shoulder or my elbow. And he'd put his finger on my elbow and my shoulder, and I would just weep. And I would cry for an hour. And then I'd get up and I'd say, "I'll see you next week. Thanks." That was it. That was the whole exchange. And then other times I'd return to my cushion because I had to stabilize. I had to cultivate pro-social qualities like loving kindness and compassion. And then the thing I did a lot was I used to go to San Francisco General Hospital where there were a lot of babies that were being born to crack mamas and addicted mothers. And I had a lot of nurse friends there. And so I would go and I would sit in a rocking chair and I would hold crack babies. And I would just rock these babies. And there was something about the innocence of them and the ability to help them sleep that soothed me and reminded me of compassion. A few years ago, I was teaching a workshop like this for a group of doctors and nurses on compassion, and I had a heart attack. Actually, I didn't have a heart attack right away. I had 3 warnings for a heart attack. I denied them all. The last warning came, I was in a video conference with Ram Dass, who I love dearly. He's an old friend, and under my breath, I was saying, "Oh, Ram Dass, shut up, you're going on too long." And it reminded me of my wife when she was giving birth to our first son, how annoyed she was with me for talking. And it was that emotional irritability that really had me see that something was wrong, and I went to the hospital and I had a heart attack in the ER. 9 months later, I went back to the same retreat center, and I had a second heart attack there, same place. My friend, Jack Cornfield, he called me up and he said, "Frank, you got to slow down." I said, "Jack, I am slowing down." I said, "I only ever have heart attacks when I'm in retreats at Catholic places like this, you know." And I was supposed to go to Italy to teach in a few weeks. He said, "Don't go to Italy." He said, "It'll kill you." He said, "Don't." Well, anyway, this experience, it was very humbling, you know. It's a powerful teaching to find your own vulnerability. And I can tell you that the view from the other side of the sheets is really different. And one of the things that became so clear to me in that time in the hospital and recovering was how much my caregivers were suffering, how close they were to their own pain, how they were driven ruthlessly by unrealistic expectations of the systems in which they worked, and how they had adapted this kind of strategy of ignoring what hurts. And in the process, most of them lost touch with their compassion. These were good people. But they had become unable to meet their own discomfort. And when I think about it, even now, as I'm standing here, it makes me really sad. How did we take this beautiful thing of caring for one another and turn it into a duty, into an obligation, into a technical task? Yeah, this extraordinary intimate thing of caring for one another. How did we do that? After my surgery, a very famous Tibetan teacher, I won't say who, he called me up to kind of cheer me up. And I thought he might give me some esoteric practices that would be helpful, you know, because I was a mess after my heart attack. I was not balanced. I was a mess. My sense of self completely dissolved, and it wasn't pleasant. I didn't see tunnels of light. I saw a lot of darkness. Anyway, he called me up, and I asked him, I knew he'd had heart trouble, so I asked him, you know, how'd you deal with this? How'd you deal with the precariousness and the drama and the pain and all of it, you know, the depression? And he said, sort of giggled, you know, and he said, "Well, I thought it was good to have a heart." And he said, "If you have a heart, you should expect it will have problems." And then he giggled, told me to rest more, and hung up. That was it. That was the whole teaching. And he was right, you know. He was right. If you have a human body, if you have a heart, you should expect it will have problems. We're always trying to banish it, you know. And when we do that, we can't learn from it. We can't learn from what our pain has to teach us about taking care of others. You know, in every Zen center outside the meditation hall, there's a big wooden block, you know, Han. It's called a Han. Those of you familiar with it, it's big, usually hardwood oak block, and usually calligraphied across the block. Sumi ink is a teaching which varies, but usually it says something like, be aware of the great matter of birth and death. Life passes swiftly. Wake up. Wake up. Do not squander this life. Yeah, that's the teaching. And every day, students are called into the zendo. When the mallet beats on the Han, eventually what happens is the Han starts to wear out, and first the words disappear, they're beaten into the wood, literally. And then after time, the Han itself becomes fragile, and it breaks apart, just like us. It seems to me that this is what comes from being vulnerable. When we relax our clinging to our treasured beliefs, when we relax our ideas, soften around our resistance to the blows of life, and we stop trying to manage the uncertainty, we hold ourselves more lightly. And I think we become a less solid thing. We become less defended, and we become more receptive to the deeper dimensions of our nature. And it influences us by illuminating the dark places, and shaking loose the calcification that's formed around our hearts. The healing's always found by going toward the suffering. Always. Where is he running in the other direction, I said this to a group years ago in northwest Idaho, and a guy said to me, he said, yep, that's like telephone poles. And I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. And I said, what do you mean? He said, telephone poles. He said, you put these telephone poles in the ground. He said, they're big, tall things. They're 40 feet high. And he said, they're unstable when they first set them in the ground. And they can fall. And if they fall on a man, they'll break his back. He said, so I said to my partner, first day on the job, he said, if that pole starts to fall, I'm running like hell that way. His partner, who was an old timer, he said, oh, you don't want to do that. He said, if that pole starts to fall, you want to go right up to it. You want to put your hands right on it. It's the only safe place to be. You understand? We're always running in the other direction, away from our pain, and it hits us in the back of the head. So when our pain is here, the only safe place to be is to go right toward it, to put our hands on it with mercy and tenderness and kindness, with compassion. But, we're masters of distraction. We are so good at distracting ourselves from our pain. This is our primary practice in America. I know everybody here practices one kind or another of Zen or Buddhism or some such thing, but if you think about how you spend your day, how much of your day you spend in mindfulness and how much of it you spend in distraction, you'll see that your primary practice is often distraction and to fend off what we feel is intolerable. Hospices and hospitals, they have a fix-it mentality, and they're environments of expectation. My friend John Kabat-Zinn, he says hospitals are dukkha magnets. They're magnets for suffering. And in such places, there's a protocol and a procedure to get you through everything. And some of that's really necessary. If it hadn't been for those protocols, I wouldn't be standing here with you. Doctors artfully cut veins and arteries from parts of my body and lifted my heart out of its body and sewed me back together again. However, when the emphasis, at least it was for me, when the emphasis is all future-oriented, when it's all about what's going to happen tomorrow, it's very hard to stay present. I had people come and visit me in the hospital, and wonderful people, Buddhist teachers, great practitioners. And they'd say, how are you today? I said, miserable. And they'd say, oh, it's going to be better tomorrow. You'll see. I'd say, yeah, but today it's miserable, Do any of you know who the 5 blind boys of Alabama are? Great a cappella African-American group. Great guys. When I was in the hospital and people were telling me it was going to get better, I didn't believe them. So I was like a teenager. I put on headphones and I listened to the 5 blind boys of Alabama, and I walked the hallways with my IV pole until I borrowed their faith until I could find my own again. A few years later, I was at a concert where they were playing, and I was backstage with them, and I said, hey, I got to thank you guys. You saved my life, And they said, what do you mean? And I told them a story of having heart attacks and all this, and the guy said, when did you do that? And I said, well, told him the time in July it happened, and he said, I was in the hospital same week. I said, how come? He said, heart attack. I said, no kidding. I said, what'd you do? He said, I had the guy sing to me. Really worked. People came into my room, but they didn't really ask me how I felt. They monitored me. They wanted to know where my pain was on a scale of 1 to 10 and whether I was doing my breathing exercises and had a bowel movement that day. I was touched, but rarely was that touch felt as healing. And that's because the staff themselves were driven mercilessly by all they had to do. I think too oftentimes in caregiving, we focus primarily on problem solving. And what happens is the person, at least this is what happened for me, the person disappears and only the problem remains. I think as caregivers, our job is not just to be problem solvers. I think our job is to be portals. Portals to another possibility. Portals to the wholeness. That's when I feel healed. I don't feel healed because my problems are being solved. I feel healed when I connect with something I lost contact with. Look, how many of you are nurses in the room? Okay, great. So you know what it's like to move somebody from the bed to the commode, right? You've done that 1,000 times probably. You lend them your body. You lend them the strength of your back, the strength of your arms and legs, right? Well, you can lend people the stability of your mind. You can open your heart in such a way that it might inspire them to open theirs. You can do that, yeah? And when you do, you become a true refuge. The word compassion, it's usually translated as suffering with others. That's the general definition. For me, the most important part of that definition is the little word in the middle, with. So what we were saying about giving and receiving a while ago. With is the most important word there, because it implies a kind of intimacy with myself and with the other person. So compassion is known, is felt as a kind of attunement, as a kind of intimacy. When caregivers are only fixated on problems or where they think you should be, there's no attunement. I don't think we help people by taking them away from their suffering. I want to say that again. I don't think we help people by taking them away from their suffering. You know, we can't open to our pain unless there's compassion. So it's impossible. Unless somewhere within us or within the person who's with us in the neighborhood, so to speak, there's some compassion. Otherwise, we can't open to it. So compassion, it provides the gentleness, the kindness, it allows our heart to open, to be seen. And when this happens, then it's possible to have what I call a soul-to-soul meeting. Yeah? Like there's these two guys in the hospice, Stephen and Rick, and they were both dying of AIDS. Rick, in addition to his HIV, had a stroke, and so he had aphasia, and he couldn't speak, and he was really not happy about this. And we tried everything to help him with this, and he just, everything sort of bounced off this force field of his, and this defenses that he had. And so anyway, this one day I said to him, you know, Rick, looks like Stephen might be dying, and if you want to say goodbye to him, today's the day. So he said, okay, and we walked down the hall together, arm in arm, and I brought him into Stephen's room, and he sat down on Stephen's bed, and I didn't intervene. I sat in the corner. That's my way. Sit in the corner, watch if anything needs to happen. You know, if your help is really needed before you jump in. And these two men, they sat on this bed together, and it was the most beautiful thing. They sat there for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, I don't know, a long time. And I didn't say a word, not a word. Time passed, you know. And then Rick nodded his head like that. And Stephen said, yeah, that was great. And Rick got up and went back to his room, and that evening Stephen died. See, Rick knew he was looking at his own destiny. He knew that in a matter of days or weeks he would die too. And he was terrified. But Stephen had done his homework. And when you went into his room, you felt like you were going into a sanctuary. He was almost transparent. And so he met all of Rick's fears with love and compassion. It was a soul-to-soul meeting, yeah? Two souls recognizing each other. For compassion to really work as a guidance, and that's how I think of it, a guidance. It's a particular guidance of our nature that arises in particular in response to the presence of suffering. Other things, other kinds of guidance arise for other purposes, but compassion arises specifically for the presence of suffering. Now, for a guide to be reliable, they have to care absolutely about you, right? That means they have to be cognizant of all the circumstances that are present, but also what matters most in this moment. Like there was a woman that I worked with, and she wanted to get married. And she was about 6 weeks from death, and she asked me if I would perform the wedding. And I said, sure, I'm happy to do it, thank you. What a beautiful honor. I'm really glad to do that. But I said, what you really need is a wedding coordinator. And I'm very good at that. I can do that, you know. And so every day we would have these discussions about the wedding. And we'd talk about the cake and whether she would be in her wheelchair or in her bed. She couldn't stand anymore. And I asked her about the guy she was marrying and, you know, was he a worthy guy and was he trustworthy and all those things. And we had great discussions because I understood that we were talking about a different kind of marriage here. And one day in the middle of talking about all the cake and all that, she just burst into tears. And she said, I just want my mom to be there. Her mom had died some years before, and so we had to talk about what it would be like if her mom was there, you know? You see, that's what mattered most. Not her cancer, not the fact that she was dying. What mattered most was that she was getting married and she wanted her mom to be there, and that was the face of her suffering. And so compassion has to have this wonderful awareness of all that's going on, but it has a kind of empathetic precision to it. It zeroes in to what matters most. One of the stories we have about compassion is that we should make other people feel safe. And that's good if you can do it. But most of the people I worked with, they didn't feel very safe. They hadn't felt safe in years. But what I found was that when I was actually abiding in a compassionate presence, when I was embodying it, not just as some silly notion, you know, or some Buddhist idea, then the people I was working with, they could see that, and they could trust that. And because they did, they were willing to go to places that seemed really unsafe, that seemed really dangerous to them, in fact, precisely because they were accompanied by compassion, and they weren't going to be left alone. Compassion snuggles up to pain. Compassion opens us to the suffering of others. One day I was in my office and the phone rang, and a man got on the phone and he said, we understand that that you could help us with our son's death, and that we want to keep him at home. And I said, yeah, sure, of course I can help you with that. And when the time comes, let's get ready for it. He said, no, you don't understand. It just happened. He said, my son died a half an hour ago, and we'd like to keep him at home. So I said, okay, I'll be right there. And I went to his house, and never met these people before. And I went into their home and into the room of this little boy, 7 years old, died of cystic fibrosis. And following my habit, I went right over to his bed and I leaned over and I kissed him on the forehead. And when I did this, the whole room broke into tears. Because while everybody had cared for him with great love, nobody had touched him since he died. Yeah. So we talked about this process, this ritual of bathing a body. Every tradition, every culture has done it for millennium. And we talked about how they might like to do it. They were great gardeners. And so they went out to the garden and they collected lemon geraniums and rose petals and sage and beautiful herbs. And they made a sort of a basin of these sweet-smelling herbs. And we got towels and washcloths, and just as mom and dad and I in the room with their 7-year-old boy. How many of you are mothers in the room? Yeah. So they started washing this boy's body. They started at the back of his head. We turned him on his side. washed him down the back, And as they did, they would stop, and some little nick or scratch, and Mother would take care of it with a lot of care. And sometimes it was too much for the dad. He just couldn't do it. He had to go to stand by the window and look out into the garden, Took a long time. Took hours to wash this boy because they'd have to stop again and again. They tell me stories about him. It's a way of getting current. Mom came to his toes. She counted his toes. She said she'd done that when he was born. And then they washed up the front of his body, And it was a hot fire. I could barely stay in the room. And his mother, she would look at me. And with these beseeching eyes, without words, she would say to me, "Can I live through this? Is it possible to live through this? Can any mother, can any parent live through this?" And my job was to give her another washcloth and to turn her back toward the suffering, because that's where the healing's always found. And she continued to bathe his body, and she got to his face, and it was so intimate between them. It's like she'd burned through a kind of grief. I don't mean her grief was over. I don't mean to suggest that. I mean that there was no separation between that mother and child in that moment. Maybe like the moment he was born, when they were swimming in the sea of non-separation, Not able to distinguish one from the other. After we finished, we invited his brothers and sisters in the room, and I asked them what he liked to do most, and they said he liked to build model airplanes. So we got all his model airplanes, we made a mobile out of them, and we hung them over the bed, My son was 7 years old at the time. And I held him very, very close that night. Sometimes I feel like I should put a warning label on the bottle of compassion. I should say to you that if you really open your heart, if you let the innate compassion of your being come forward, a lot of pain will show up in your life. And I don't want to scare you, but I want to prepare you for the truth that pain wants to expose itself to the healing agent of compassion. And so it will find it. Right now in Poland, Bernie Glassman is in Poland with my friends Andreas and a number of other great friends doing the plunge into Auschwitz and Birkenau. And I was there in the first couple of retreats, and every day we had groups. We do counsel practice, wisdom circles. And in my circle of 30 or so people, there were people who were coming from all over the world, practitioners, sons of soldiers, and people who had sons of relatives who had died in the camps. And one woman in my circle who had been a child in the camps and was now back in Birkenau. And anyway, this one night, I went back, I snuck into Birkenau, right? I went back into the camps, and the camps are these big horse barns, that people lived in. And there was one barracks that was just for the children. And I went to that barracks, and I sat there doing compassion practice. Through the night, I would decide that I would do compassion practice through the night. And doing my practice, after an hour or two, a woman or someone came into the other end of the barn where I couldn't see in the darkness. And she began to howl like I've never heard anybody scream in my life. I never even heard animals make those sounds. And I went up and sat beside her. It was this woman who had been a child in the camps. And there's no words at this moment. All you can do is bear witness. You sit beside and you don't leave. That's what compassion is. You stay in the room when the going gets tough. And we passed the night together. And we went back to the hostel in the morning, and I had to get on a plane to go to Germany to teach some workshops I was leading there on grief and forgiveness. And I was in Berlin, and I taught this workshop on forgiveness for 3 days, and at the end of it, I didn't say anything about Auschwitz, and at the end of it, we're ready to go home. It's a big room like this, and just a woman in the back of the room, she raised her hand, and I thought, it's time to go, I want to get something to eat. But I thought, okay, one question. And she raised it up and she said, Frank, I've been listening to you for days talk about forgiveness. She said, but my heart feels like stone. It's like ice. She said, my father was a prisoner in the camps and he died in the camps. And I can't forgive. Again, what can you do? You can bear witness. There's no words for this. So you stand and you bear witness. And then another hand went up on the other side of the room. And I thought, here the stories will come. And I hadn't talked about Auschwitz, but here they were. It was in the field somehow, and they came. And I thought, there's someone else will stand and tell about her family who died in the camps. And she stood up, she said, my heart's also like stone. It's like ice. My father was a Nazi officer, and I know that he killed people, and I can't forgive him. Wow. And then these two women, they were so brave. They were so brave. They came to the front of the room, and they crossed, and they stood in front of the room, and they held each other. They just held each other. No words. Soul to soul meeting. Your suffering is my suffering. Sometimes compassion seems to heal a particular hurt right away. But sometimes it doesn't. My friend Michael, he had MS, and I worked with him for 15 years, getting ready for his dying. 15 years. And one night he called me, he said, can you come over? And I went over to his house, and he said, Frank, I just came back from the intensive care unit, and I'm not going back, that's it. And I said, oh, Michael, how come? And he said, I was scared. All this work we've been doing, 15 years we've been doing this work, and I'm still scared. I'm not going back. And after a pause, I said to Michael, oh, Michael, that fear is never going to go away. And he looked at me. First he was shocked, and then he said, that's the most comforting thing anyone's ever told me. I said, yeah, it's not going to go away. So we have to find some part of you that can be with this fear. Yeah. So one of the ways we talk about compassion is as a relief of suffering, but I think there's a deeper truth to compassion. I think compassion is about helping us see what's true, the truth that we find in the middle of suffering. And some of the real work of compassion isn't always about taking away the suffering. It's about giving us the capacity to be with suffering, to be with it, not to leave the room, not to leave the horse barn. And then by staying with it, our defenses against what hurts fall down, like the walls of Jericho. And when our defenses fall down, then we can see what the true suffering is caused by, what the real causes of the suffering are, and then we can skillfully intervene. Then we can do something. So for me, the deepest part of compassion is that it helps us to come to what's true. Compassion is what enables us to feel with intimacy, with attunement. Do you notice there was a picture of a woman with a fist? Well, he's going to get it up in a second. And there was a couple of pictures of the same woman. There was another picture of a woman lying down. She had died. Did you notice that picture? Yeah, same woman. This was taken 2 hours after she entered the hospice. This is taken 2 hours after she died. Right? What happened between that and that? She had a chance to tell her story, have someone listen. She had time to reflect, consider what was of meaning and value in her life. She had time to write in her journals, leave a legacy. What do we get from that? We were sitting, that's the kitchen at Zen Hospice. And we were sitting at the table, she was writing in her journals, and I was reading from a book of Japanese death poems. You know Japanese death poems? Well, it's a tradition, sometimes amongst Zen practitioners, but just among people, that on the day of your death, you write a poem that tells the essential truth of your whole life. Yeah? How awake do you have to be for that? And if you don't die that day, it doesn't count. You have to write another one the next day. Yeah? So I was reading this book of Zen death poems, and she said, "What are those?" And I told her about the tradition, and she said, "I want to write one of those." I said, "Okay, you should write one." She said, "What's the form?" I said, "Don't worry about the form, just write it." A few hours later, she called me up to her room. And she said, "Frank, I wrote my poem. I want you to learn it by heart." She didn't say memorize it. She said, "I want you to learn it by heart." I said, "I'd be honored." When people are dying, sometimes they have a gift to give, and somebody has to receive it. So she gave it to me, and I recited it. I had to keep reciting it until she was sure that I knew it by heart. Yeah. And then after she was sure of that, she said, "I want to be cremated with it." That's her death poem, pinned to her bedclothes. Yeah. You want to hear it? She said, "Don't just stand there with your hair turning gray. Soon enough the seas will sink your little island. So while there is still the illusion of time, set out for some other shore. No sense packing a bag. You won't be able to lift it into your boat. Give away all of your collections. Take only new seeds and an old stick. Send out some prayers on the wind before you sail. Don't be afraid. Someone knows you're coming. An extra fish has been salted." Her name is Sono, and that was her death poem. Don't just stand there with your hair turning gray. Soon enough, the seas will sink your little island. So while there is still the illusion of time, set out for some other shore. Death is not a full stop in her mind. No sense packing a bag. You won't be able to lift it into your boat. So give away all of your collections. Take only new seeds and an old stick. You know how farmers would work? Stick in the ground, seed, stick in the ground, seed. Yeah, that's how we plant the fields, right? This means it's not a full stop. Impermanence is not just about endings. It's not about things falling off the edge of the earth. It's the law of change and becoming. Like only new seeds and an old stick. Send out some prayers on the wind before you sail. Don't try and do this alone. It's too much. Don't be afraid. Someone knows you're coming. An extra fish has been salted. Thank you, Sana. Thank you all very much.